So I want you to just imagine a single piece of bedrock.
Just one rock.
Yeah, exactly. Just one jagged outcropping of stone right there in the Middle East. And over the last 3,000 years or so, literally millions of people have bled for it.
It's honestly hard to even wrap your head around the scale of it.
It really is. I mean, empires have utterly bankrupted themselves just to build walls around this one spot. The greatest military commanders in human history have marched across entire continents to claim it.
Oh, absolutely.
And even today, the entire globe is regularly pushed right to the brink of this profound conflict over who actually gets to control the specific tiny plot of land.
Right.
Because we are talking about a place that holds the mountain where Abraham is said to have offered Isaac. It's got the site of the ancient Hebrew temple.
The hill of Christ's crucifixion, too.
Yes, and the tomb of the Virgin Mary, and, the rock from which the prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. I mean, we are, of course, talking about Jerusalem.
We are. And I think right off the bat, we need to draw a very firm line in the sand regarding what we are actually doing today.
Definitely.
Because the moment you hear the word Jerusalem, it is almost impossible not to immediately pull up today's political headlines, right?
Yeah.
The breaking news alerts, the intensely painful modern conflicts that just, well, they dominate our screens.
Yeah, you can't help it. It's everywhere.
Exactly. But that is deliberately not our mission here today.
No, not at all. We are pulling the camera way, way back. Today's Deep Dives is an exploration of the underlying sacred geography of Jerusalem.
Sacred geography, I love that term.
Right? It's perfect. We are looking exclusively through the incredibly rigorous historical lens of Karen Armstrong. Specifically, we're diving into her acclaimed book, A History of Jerusalem, One City, Three Faiths.
And we got a lot of supporting material, too.
Yeah, we've compiled the structure of her book, her various academic interviews, and, critical reviews from the London Review of Books and the Daily Telegraph, just to truly dissect the ancient beating heart of this city.
Which means our approach here is to examine the mechanics of how Jews, Christians, and Muslims have conceptually mapped this physical space over thousands of years. And look, the sources we are drawing from deal with history that is deeply sensitive. It's emotionally raw, heavily politicized. So I want to be incredibly clear to you listening.
Yeah.
Our goal is not to arbitrate modern geopolitical disputes.
No, definitely not.
Nor are we taking a side in the modern conflict. We are here to impartially report on Karen Armstrong's historical synthesis. We're just looking at her data to understand the why and the how beneath the thousands of years of headlines.
Right. And to even begin to process the city through Armstrong's lens, we really have to start with Armstrong herself.
We do. Her personal story is key here.
It totally is. Her own personal cognitive dissonance is actually the perfect entry point because the bias she initially brought to Jerusalem is one that honestly deeply infects a massive portion of the Western world today.
Oh, without a doubt. Her background completely framed her initial worldview. So Karen Armstrong was a former Catholic nun.
Yeah.
She spent years in a convent, totally immersed in a very specific theological framework. And then fast forward to 1983, she travels to Jerusalem to film a television documentary for Channel 4 about the life of St. Paul.
And she arrived carrying what she freely admits was an entirely isolated, purely Christian perspective.
Totally isolated.
Like, she basically expected a Christian theme park.
A theme park, yeah. That's exactly it.
A quiet, contemplative diorama where she could just, stroll down the Via Dolorosa, sit peacefully in the Garden of Gethsemane, and feel this pristine, uninterrupted connection to the Jesus of her childhood.
She had constructed this mental geography where Jerusalem existed solely as the backdrop for the New Testament.
Right, like the rest of the world just paused.
Exactly. But the physical reality of the city absolutely crushed that expectation within hours of her arrival.
Oh, I bet.
Because Jerusalem is not a quiet diorama. It is intensely crowded. It's loud. It's physically overwhelming. But more importantly, the sacred geography is literally stacked on top of itself.
Yeah.
You have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam practically breathing down each other's necks.
Sharing the exact same walls.
The same walls, the same alleys, the same ancient stones.
I can just imagine the sheer shock of that. You go expecting this solo, peaceful retreat, and you walk into a three-way millennial family dispute.
It really is a family dispute.
Yeah.
And that shock forced a massive psychological pivot for Armstrong.
How so?
Well, looking at this profound, uneasy physical overlap, she realized she had spent her entire life viewing Judaism merely as a narrative prologue to Christianity.
Wow, just a prologue.
Yeah, like a historical waiting room that only existed so Jesus could eventually walk through the door.
That is such a powerful way to put it.
And perhaps even more jarringly, she realized she had practically zero mental architecture for Islam's connection to the city. The physical stones of Jerusalem basically forced her to confront this immense historical blind spot.
And that confrontation birthed the central thesis of her entire work on the city, the thing she calls triple vision.
Triple vision, yes.
She concluded that it is intellectually and historically impossible to understand the nature of God or the nature of the city without viewing all three monotheistic faiths simultaneously.
And that triple vision is the foundational framework we have to maintain today as we go through this.
Right.
It requires looking at these three religions of Abraham not as totally isolated phenomena that just happen to hate each other. We have to see them as a single, sprawling, chaotic family tradition that evolved in three distinct directions.
I think the best way to visualize this triple vision is to think of a glass prism.
Oh yeah, the prism analogy is great.
If you hold a prism up and you only look at the red light refracting out of one angle or, the blue light bending out of another, you are completely ignoring the fundamental reality that it is all originating from a single unified beam of light entering the glass. Armstrong is demanding that we look at the whole prism. We have to acknowledge the single source of light while rigorously studying the different colors that emerge.
And taking that prism analogy a step further, the triple vision illuminates both the profound interconnectedness of the faiths, but also the agonizing tragedy of their hostility.
Because they share so much.
They share the same prophets, the same foundational concepts of a transcendent creator, and the same sacred geography. The historical hostility isn't the clash of alien civilizations, it's a civil war.
And civil wars are always the most vicious.
Always. Because the combatants share the same house.
But to understand why this specific house, these particular hills in the Levant evoke such a vicious, possessive love, we actually have to entirely discard our modern worldview.
This is a really crucial point.
We have to look at how ancient people processed physical reality, which brings us to a massive psychological divide, the difference between mythos and logos.
Yeah, if you don't grasp the mechanics of mythos versus logos, the violence of Jerusalem's history will just look like primitive insanity to you.
Right, it just looks like madness.
Armstrong relies heavily on this distinction. See, modern human beings operate almost entirely on logos.
Let's define logos so we have a solid baseline here.
Good idea.
Armstrong points out that modern humans have developed a logical and discursive mode of thought. We look at a physical object, we strip away all its emotional or spiritual resonance, and we just analyze the thing itself. So we look at a piece of bedrock, and we see calcium carbonate. We measure its density, its age, its utility.
Right, logos is the scientific method.
Exactly.
It is the architectural blueprint of reality. It's the cognitive tool we use to build suspension bridges, sequence the human genome, fly to the moon.
It's very practical.
Highly practical. It is strictly concerned with what is materially verifiable.
Yeah.
But logos is entirely useless when you are trying to comfort a grieving mother, or when you're trying to understand the ultimate meaning of human existence.
Right. So if logos is, the architectural blueprint of a house detailing the load-bearing walls and the electrical wiring, then mythos is that intangible, powerful feeling of home you get when you actually walk through the front door.
That is the perfect distinction.
You can't measure home with a ruler, but it is an undeniably real human experience.
Exactly. And ancient mythology, Armstrong argues, was never meant to be a literal, historically verifiable account of events.
It wasn't.
No, it was mythos. It was an attempt to articulate the inner significance of the human experience.
Oh, I see.
When ancient people contemplated the universe, they felt a profound sense of transcendence and mystery. They experienced the divine not as some distant entity sitting on a cloud in outer space, but as something woven into the very fabric of reality.
In fact, Armstrong uses this incredible phrase. She says they encountered the divine in the ground of our being.
Yes. And that phrase is the absolute key to unlocking the concept of sacred space.
What?
Think about it. If you feel the divine in the ground of your being, human psychology demands a physical, geographical anchor for that feeling.
Right, you need something you can touch.
You need a tangible place on Earth where the barrier between the mortal and the divine is permeable, a place where you can physically walk up and touch the infinite.
Okay, so a physical shrine or a temple or a holy mountain isn't just a building where people happen to gather for a club meeting.
Not at all.
It is the physical manifestation of their spiritual identity.
It is their psychological umbilical cord to the universe.
Wow. Which fundamentally changes the stakes of every conflict in the city's history.
Entirely.
Because if you lived in ancient Jerusalem, your spiritual identity was permanently fused to the stones of the temple or the sanctuary. So if an invading army breaches the walls and bulldozes that sacred space, you aren't just losing valuable real estate.
Right.
You aren't just experiencing a tragic loss of civic architecture.
Right. And as Armstrong vividly notes, the violation of a sacred space is experienced by the believers as a visceral, physical attack on their own bodies.
Which is intense.
She actually uses the word rape to describe the emotional trauma of having a sacred site destroyed. It is an intimate, existential annihilation.
That framing completely alters how I read the history.
Doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, if someone burns down my local bank, I'm annoyed, but I just go to another branch.
Right. You just use the ATM across town.
Exactly. But if someone destroys the sole physical tether connecting my soul to the creator of the universe, my reaction isn't annoyance. It is a desperate, violent fight for my own spiritual survival.
And because that emotional connection is so violently intimate, conquering empires throughout history couldn't just defeat the local armies and collect taxes.
They had to go further.
To truly dominate Jerusalem, they had to physically conquer the topography itself. They had to systematically bury the mythos of their predecessors under thousands of tons of their own masonry.
Which brings us to the actual physical evolution of the city. Because the sheer volume of architectural erasure detailed in Armstrong's maps and timelines is just dizzying.
It really is a lot to take in.
The city's identity changes hands like this chaotic relay race of empires.
And we can trace this topographical warfare from the very beginning of the book. You start with the ancient Canaanite and Jebusite stronghold of Zion.
Right.
Then around the 10th century BCE, it's conquered and becomes the city of David. It evolves into the center of the First Temple period, heavily fortified by Israelite kings.
And then comes the Babylonian destruction.
Yes, the devastating Babylonian destruction, the subsequent exile. But it is slowly rebuilt, eventually leading to the massive, monumental architecture of Herodian Jerusalem in the 1st century BCE.
And Herod essentially turned the Temple Mount into one of the most astonishing architectural complexes in the ancient world.
Absolutely massive.
But the Romans don't just conquer Herod's city later on. They systematically attempt to erase it from human memory.
The Roman suppression of the Jewish revolts, which culminated around 135 CE under Emperor Hadrian, is a masterclass in topographical warfare.
What did Hadrian actually do?
Well, Hadrian didn't just knock down a few walls. He brought in Roman contractors to plow the ruins of the Jewish holy sites into the dirt.
Literally plowing them under.
Literally. He fundamentally altered the street grid to reflect a Roman pagan city. He built a temple to Jupiter directly over the site of the Jewish temple.
Wow.
And then he completely erased the name Jerusalem from the map.
Right, renaming the city Aelia Capitolina.
Exactly. And he legally banned Jews from even entering the city limits. He tried to create a fact by making the Jewish mythos physically inaccessible.
Creating facts. That is the phrase Armstrong uses to describe this phenomenon, and it perfectly encapsulates the hubris of it all.
Hubris is the right word.
It's the belief that if you pour enough concrete, if you build a heavy enough dome or a high enough wall, you can permanently lock God into your building and lock your enemies out forever.
And the Christian Roman Empire, the Byzantines, did the exact same thing centuries later.
Right, with Constantine.
When Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity, his architects didn't just build the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in an empty field. They actively built over Roman pagan temples.
Just paving right over them.
Yep, and they aggressively stamped a triumphant Christian topography across the city. They intentionally left the Jewish Temple Mount in ruins as a theological statement.
Like a physical proof that the Old Covenant was dead and the new one had triumphed.
Exactly, and the cycle simply never stops.
Never. The Islamic conquest in the 7th century introduces monumental architecture like the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Right, transforming the city into Beit al-Makis and later Al-Quds.
And then the Crusaders arrive from Europe in 1099, and what do? They physically alter the Islamic structures.
They placed a cross right on top of the Dome of the Rock.
And turned it into a Christian church. They chiseled away at the Islamic identity to claim the bedrock for their own Latin rights.
And Armstrong brings this architectural warfare right up to the modern era. She points out that the modern state of Israel, after 2 millennia of exile, has returned to Zion and is actively creating facts on the ground through modern infrastructure and settlements.
Every single victorious power in the history of Jerusalem operates under the exact same illusion.
The illusion that their bricks and mortar will be the final layer.
But the greatest, most terrifying irony of Armstrong's entire historical synthesis is her observation that, and I'll just quote it here, "One thing that the history of Jerusalem teaches is that nothing is irreversible."
That is a staggering realization when you really look at the timeline.
It gives you chills. Think about the ancient Jews in the 2nd century, standing on a distant hill, looking at Roman temples built directly on top of their holiest site.
Forbidden from even approaching it.
Right. And the Roman Empire controlled the known world at that time. They must have felt an absolute crushing certainty that they would never, ever get their city back. The Roman facts on the ground seemed as permanent as the sun.
But then fast forward to the year 1099. The Muslim inhabitants of the city look over the walls and see thousands of heavily armored European crusaders.
Just a terrifying sight.
And when the walls fall and the crusaders desecrate the Haram al-Sharif, turning the Muslim sanctuaries into Christian command posts, the Islamic world must have felt the exact same apocalyptic despair.
The Crusaders appeared to be an invincible, unstoppable plague.
But the Roman Empire collapsed.
And a century later, the Crusaders were driven out. Every single empire, that arrogance convinced them they had built the final, unbreakable fortress in Jerusalem, eventually crumbled into dust.
And Armstrong draws a really profound theological warning from this cycle.
What's the warning?
She argues that the downfall of these empires invariably stems from a specific kind of spiritual decay and idolatry.
Now, how does she define idolatry in this context? Because, we usually think of idolatry as bowing down to a golden calf or something.
Sure. In this context, the idolatry is seeing the physical shrine or the political control of the city as the ultimate goal of the religion itself, rather than a means to a higher spiritual end.
Ah, I see.
When a religious group demands absolute exclusivity, when they decree, "This bedrock is ours alone, our God only speaks our language, and everyone else must be subjugated, excluded, or killed," that exclusivity turns their faith into a weapon.
And weapons eventually break.
Exactly. They become brittle.
The Crusaders are actually the perfect example of this. Armstrong notes that they lost the city because they became trapped in a dream of hatred and intolerance.
They really were trapped.
They were so obsessed with defending the stones of the Holy Sepulchre from the infidel that they completely abandoned the actual teachings of Jesus regarding love, mercy, and humility.
They worshipped the architecture and it destroyed them.
So, if demanding exclusive dominance and building massive fortresses guarantees your eventual downfall, the obvious historical question is, what actually works?
Right. Which rulers in the long, bloody history of Jerusalem actually managed to hold on to the city for substantial periods without the society tearing itself apart from the inside?
And this is where Armstrong's rigorously impartial examination of the historical data provides some incredibly challenging insights.
Especially for Western readers who might be operating on a very sanitized, Eurocentric version of history.
Exactly. When we evaluate the conquerors based on their urban policies, whether they relied on cruelty, compassion, or coexistence, the scorecard is jarring.
Very jarring. Let's examine the Byzantine Christian rules as our first data point.
Okay.
Their policy toward the previous inhabitants was one of absolute, uncompromising exclusion. They codified laws that permanently banned Jews from residing in or even entering Jerusalem. They used the power of the state to enforce a complete theological monopoly.
And then you leap forward to the Christian Crusaders in 1099. They didn't just settle for legal exclusion.
No, they opted for wholesale extermination.
The historical accounts from the Crusader breach of the walls are horrifying. They slaughtered the Muslim population. They burned the Jewish population alive inside their synagogues.
And they even turned on Eastern Christians who didn't subscribe to the Pope's Latin theology.
They literally waded through blood to purify the city.
But in stark contrast to the Byzantine and Crusader models of exclusion and extermination, Armstrong points out that the historical data shows Islam having a markedly different, more humane track record in the city over the centuries.
And she traces the mechanism for this tolerance directly to the theology of the Quran, right?
She does.
Wait, so if the Crusaders thought exclusion was the theological answer, but Islamic empires historically allowed for coexistence, does that mean the Quran mandated a different urban policy?
Essentially, yes. Armstrong emphasizes that the Quran is structurally a pluralistic scripture.
Okay.
It does not claim that Islam is the first and only truth. Rather, it explicitly validates the previous revelations of God. It legally recognizes Jews and Christians as people of the book, affording them protected status or dhimmi. Now, while it wasn't a modern secular democracy by any stretch, this theological framework meant that Islamic rulers in Jerusalem were often religiously obligated to allow the other monotheistic faiths to exist and worship within the city.
The sources highlight two specific, monumental historical events that perfectly illustrate this Quranic mechanism in action.
Yes, two great examples.
The first is Caliph Umar's conquest of Jerusalem in the year 638.
Just a few years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad.
Right. Umar rides into the city as a conqueror, but instead of tearing down the Christian sites, as past empires would have done, he actively negotiates the protection of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
And there's that famous historical account, right?
Yes, where he is inside the church when it is time for Muslim prayer, and he refuses to pray inside. He steps outside instead, specifically so his followers wouldn't later use his prayer as a pretext to convert the church into a mosque.
That single act of spatial respect is a masterclass in coexistence.
It really is.
But Umar did something even more profound. He reversed the centuries-old Byzantine ban and explicitly invited Jewish families to return to Jerusalem.
Wow!
After hundreds of years of Christian exile, it was an Islamic caliph who restored the Jewish presence in their holy city.
And the second example is just as powerful, the Sultan Saladin in 1187.
Ah, yes.
The Crusaders had violently held the city for nearly a century at this point. Saladin finally defeats the Crusader armies at the Horns of Hattin and lays siege to Jerusalem.
And the Crusader inhabitants inside the walls were terrified.
And rightly so.
Yeah, because the standard operating procedure for ancient warfare, and certainly the precedent the Crusaders themselves had set in 1099, dictated that the city would be sacked and the population massacred in retribution.
Blood for blood.
Exactly. But Saladin actively refuses to repeat the cycle.
He doesn't slaughter the Christians. He allows them to pay a ransom and leave the city peacefully.
And Armstrong highlights the most astonishing detail about this.
What's that?
Saladin allowed these Crusader knights and their families to leave, fully aware that many of them were marching directly to the coastal stronghold of Tyre, where they would immediately regroup and join the Third Crusade to continue fighting him.
Wait, really? From a purely logistical military standpoint, letting enemy combatants walk away to fight another day is strategic madness.
Absolute madness. But Saladin prioritized the sanctity of Jerusalem over his own military advantage. He understood that you cannot claim to be defending a holy city while simultaneously turning its streets into a slaughterhouse.
That is profound. So, applying Armstrong's impartial historical lens to the modern era, how does she evaluate the Israeli administration of Jerusalem since the city was unified under their control in 1967?
Well, Armstrong applies the exact same metrics to the modern state of Israel, as she does to the Byzantines, the Crusaders, and the Caliphs. She states clearly that the Israelis are by no means the worst conquerors in the city's long history. They have not engaged in the wholesale slaughter of their predecessors like the Crusaders, nor have they instituted the absolute total exclusion that the Byzantines enforced.
Right. The holy sites of the major faiths largely remain intact and, under normal circumstances, accessible.
However, based on her synthesis, she notes that the modern administration has not risen to the high, pluralistic standards set by leaders like Caliph Umar.
No.
The current reality of this city is deeply fraught. It's heavily militarized, defensive, and aggressively territorial. It operates far more on a model of nervous dominance than peaceful coexistence.
Which brings us to perhaps the most poignant historical irony in the entire narrative of Jerusalem. It is an irony regarding the Jewish relationship with the city.
Right. On the two most significant occasions in history, when Jews were permitted to return to Jerusalem after facing total exile and banishment by European Christian powers, it was specifically an Islamic conquest that opened the gates for them.
Caliph Umar invited them back in 638.
And Saladin allowed them to resettle after defeating the Crusaders in 1187.
When you look at the entire sweeping timeline of Armstrong's book, the empirical data points to a very clear conclusion.
Very clear. The societies that managed to hold the city the longest, and the periods where the city actually thrived as a center of culture and spirituality, were those periods characterized by some structural accommodation for tolerance.
Exclusivity is a fast track to collapse.
And coexistence is the only proven strategy for longevity.
So, if history definitively proves that tolerance is the best survival strategy, why do we constantly see a reversion to violence? I mean, if the data says coexist to survive, why do people keep choosing the sword?
That is the core tragedy of Jerusalem. And Armstrong answers it by exposing a fatal paradox within human religious behavior.
A paradox.
Yes. It is a tension between two fundamentally opposing religious duties.
Armstrong frames this paradox perfectly. She writes, "Then as now, there would always be people who preferred the option of devoting their religious energies to sacred space over the more difficult duty of compassion."
The devotion to sacred space versus the difficult duty of compassion. That tension explains almost every drop of blood spilled in this city.
To understand the psychology of this, imagine you were given a breathtaking, priceless masterpiece of a painting.
Okay.
The artwork itself depicts a beautiful, complex vision of a world built on profound morality, radical empathy, and universal love. And this masterpiece is housed inside an incredibly ornate, heavy gold frame.
I like this analogy.
Right. What Armstrong is observing is a historical phenomenon where people become entirely obsessed with the frame.
They ignore the art.
They spend all their money polishing the gold. They build massive security vaults to protect the frame. They will literally stab their neighbor to death if their neighbor touches the frame.
And all the while, they never once look at the painting itself.
Exactly. They are worshiping the physical boundaries of the religion while entirely ignoring the moral teachings that the religion exists to convey.
That is a phenomenal way to understand the idolatry of sacred space. It is infinitely easier for human beings to focus on a tangible, physical object than it is to engage in internal spiritual transformation.
So much easier.
Building a massive wall around a shrine is a difficult engineering task, sure, but it's finite. You can finish the wall, dust off your hands, and congratulate yourself on your absolute piety.
But the duty of compassion, the command to love your enemy, to care for the poor, to forgive those who wrong you.
That is a terrifying, never-ending task. It is emotionally exhausting. It requires the constant suppression of your own ego.
Yeah.
It requires you to look at a person who worships differently than you and recognize their shared humanity. Given the choice between the grueling daily work of compassion and the thrilling finite work of defending a stone building, humanity has historically chosen to defend the stones almost every time.
But during her years of researching the ancient texts, Armstrong uncovered a theological concept from the ancient Near East that totally destroys this idea of worshiping the stones in a vacuum.
She did. She found that in antiquity, there was an absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite for a city to be considered holy.
Yes, the ancient linkage between holiness and social justice.
She points out that in the ancient mindset, you cannot simply declare a piece of real estate holy just because a prophet walked there 1,000 years ago.
Holiness was not a permanent, passive state. A city could only maintain its holiness if it was actively, vigorously practicing social justice within its walls.
This is an incredibly challenging concept for the modern mind to grasp. We tend to think of holiness as a property of the rocks themselves.
Right, like radiation or something.
Exactly. But in the ancient traditions, particularly in Judaism and Islam, holiness was contingent on human behavior.
So, if a society becomes corrupt, if the leaders oppress the poor, if the legal system is unjust, they are quite literally draining the holiness out of the city.
Precisely. Armstrong highlights that while this concept was sometimes obscured in later Christian devotions, which often treated the city more as a static museum of relics from the life of Jesus, the requirement of justice was paramount in the bedrock of the other traditions.
Like in the Hebrew Bible.
Yes. In the Hebrew Bible, prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah scream at the Israelites, warning them that their elaborate temple rituals and their sacrifices mean absolutely nothing to God if they are simultaneously neglecting the widow, the orphan, and the stranger.
The physical temple could not protect them from the consequences of their own societal injustice.
And in Islam, the structural foundation of the Ummah, the community, is built on equity, charity, and a just legal framework.
You cannot claim to venerate the third holiest site in Islam while operating a society defined by systemic cruelty.
Therefore, when we witness the historical or modern violence in Jerusalem, we are not just looking at a failure of international diplomacy or a breakdown in peace talks. By the very internal logic of the faith themselves, violence and systemic injustice in Jerusalem represent a catastrophic theological failure.
When the city lacks justice, it ceases to be a holy city and becomes just another bloody battlefield over ancient rocks.
Which inevitably forces us to look at the reality of Jerusalem today through Armstrong's synthesized lens.
If social justice and mutual respect are the only ways to keep the battery of holiness charged, how does she evaluate the current trajectory of the city?
Well, the timeline of her own relationship with the city provides a very stark, very depressing metric.
Let's talk about that. When she first arrived to film her documentary in 1983, she noted that despite the underlying political tensions, there was still a functional, physical overlap.
Right. She wrote about feeling perfectly safe walking through the labyrinthine alleys of the old city at night. She could wander through the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, the Jewish quarter, and witness the complex, shared rhythm of life.
It wasn't a utopia, but it was a functioning shared space.
But look at her perspective by the time of her major interviews around 2005.
Yeah, quite a jump.
This is after the trauma of the First and Second Intifadas, after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in the deeply paranoid post-9/11 world, and following the death of Yasser Arafat.
The atmosphere had totally calcified.
Completely. She explicitly states that the city of peace had tragically devolved into a city of war.
The physical barriers, the checkpoints, the security walls had exponentially multiplied. But more devastatingly, the psychological walls had become almost impenetrable.
The triple vision she spent a book advocating for the ability to see the interconnectedness of the faiths had been entirely replaced by a terrified, aggressive tunnel vision on all sides.
Everyone in the city felt overwhelmingly vulnerable.
And as history shows, vulnerable communities almost always react with desperate aggression.
So if we take everything Armstrong has synthesized, the historical proof that exclusivity inevitably leads to destruction, the understanding that bricks and mortar provide zero guarantee of permanence, and the theological reality that a lack of social justice drains a city of its holiness. What is the actual way out?
Well, she does explore several theoretical diplomatic solutions in the text.
She runs through the various frameworks that international diplomats and the UN have proposed over the decades, right?
The first is the concept of a corpus separatum.
Meaning an internationalized city.
Right. Jerusalem would basically be a separate entity governed by the United Nations or a consortium of international powers, completely removing sovereignty from both the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Which is an elegant solution on a whiteboard in Geneva.
Oh, absolutely. But in reality, no deeply rooted religious or national group is going to willingly surrender their emotional capital to a rotating cast of international bureaucrats.
Oh, of course not. She also explores the idea of maintaining unified Israeli sovereignty over the entire city, but granting highly elevated autonomous privileges and administrative control to the Palestinian Authority in specific neighborhoods and over specific holy sites.
But Armstrong looks past these compromises and makes a much more radical, historically grounded claim regarding the ultimate solution.
What's her claim?
After synthesizing 3,000 years of demographic shifts, sieges, and architectural warfare, she concludes that there is only one mathematically and historically viable path forward.
Joint sovereignty.
Joint sovereignty.
A shared administration of an undivided city by both Israelis and Palestinians. No exclusive flags, no absolute dominance.
Yes. And she is incredibly clear-eyed about how this sounds. In her 2005 interviews, she openly acknowledges that suggesting joint sovereignty while suicide bombers and military checkpoints are actively defining the daily reality sounds impossibly, almost offensively, utopian.
It sounds naive.
But she isn't basing her conclusion on the political climate of a single decade.
She's looking at the macro data of 3 millennia.
Exactly. Her argument is rooted in empirical historical precedent. Every single attempt to maintain exclusive sterile sovereignty over Jerusalem has eventually resulted in catastrophic violence and the collapse of the ruling power.
The Romans tried it and failed. The Crusaders tried it and failed.
An ongoing deadly struggle for total dominance will simply reset the historical timer until the next collapse.
And she views the city not just as a piece of the Middle East conflict, but as the absolute linchpin. She argues that you will never have a lasting peace in the broader Middle East until Jerusalem itself is at peace.
The city is the ultimate knot. If you try to pull the ropes of peace without first untying the knot of Jerusalem, you just pull the knot tighter.
And untying that knot demands a massive theological evolution from the people who claim to love the city.
It requires the believers to step away from the idolatry of the physical shrines. It requires them to internalize the ancient teachings of their own prophets.
That the truest, most potent essence of the city's holiness is not found in the bedrock, but in the practice of radical social justice and compassion.
Armstrong leaves us with a profound, sobering warning. The wisest, most enlightened theologians across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have always understood this truth.
But as she sadly notes, these voices of pluralism and compassion are historically few in number.
And they're almost always drowned out by the louder, angrier voices of exclusivity.
The eternal danger is allowing our highest, most beautiful spiritual ideals to be dragged into the mud and debased by bitter territorial rivalries.
So, synthesizing everything we've covered today, we began with the modern expectation that history and geography are precise sciences.
We expected clean lines on a map.
But Karen Armstrong has revealed that the sacred geography of Jerusalem operates on an entirely different plane of reality. Jerusalem is not merely a location on a map. It is a mirror.
A mirror. That is the perfect encapsulation of her work.
It is a mirror held up to the human soul.
Wow.
On one hand, it reflects humanity's most breathtaking capacities. Our desperate yearning for transcendence, our ability to construct soaring architecture in pursuit of the divine, and our deep need to anchor ourselves to something greater than our mortal lives.
But the mirror also reflects our most grotesque, tragic flaws. It reflects our infinite capacity for greed, our terrifying tribalism, and our historic willingness to prioritize the defense of dead stones over the lives of breathing human beings.
The history of Jerusalem is an empirical 3,000-year study proving that bricks and mortar are completely temporary.
The data definitively shows that exclusivity always breeds its own violent destruction.
And the theology dictates that true holiness cannot be walled in. It requires the grueling, unglamorous daily work of social justice.
Which brings us to a final, necessary question to leave you with today. We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing the macro history of Jerusalem. But Armstrong's ultimate lesson is not meant to be kept at a safe academic distance.
We have to apply the mechanics of sacred space to our own lives.
If the historical and theological essence of a place's holiness is inherently tethered to compassion, if the battery of the divine dies the moment you disconnect the electricity of human decency, what happens to the spiritual validity of the sacred spaces in your own life?
Think about your local church, your neighborhood mosque, your synagogue, or even a secular institution or monument that you revere.
What actually happens to the sanctity of those spaces when the people fiercely defending them abandon the very principles of justice and empathy those buildings were constructed to represent?
Are we all, in our own localized ways, guilty of frantically polishing the ornate gold frame while entirely ignoring the masterpiece inside?
Are we worshiping the comforting bricks of our own beliefs while skipping right over the vulnerable people standing outside the walls?
So what do you think about?
When you look at it that way, the murky, overlapping history of Jerusalem doesn't just show us the story of a distant city in the Middle East. It provides a devastatingly clear diagnostic image of our own hearts. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking past the bricks, and we will see you next time.